is just a little bit taller than me, so. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here for our last 4 speeches. Today, I'm going to be talking about one thing that we all know of. We've all used it. It can be passed down through our family generations, or it can be created individually. Now that thing is a recipe. There are millions of recipes across our world. There are recipes for rich and smooth chocolate cake for birthdays. There's recipes for savory and fried chicken at picnics, and my favorite, homemade cheese fries topped with bacon. The extraordinary part of any recipe is that it comes with a set of instructions, and if those instructions are followed, then the results are guaranteed. Now, what if you could have a perfect recipe for a perfect marriage? What if you could figure out a perfect methodology which teaches you how to go about finding a spouse and guarantees a great relationship? Well, to many people's joy, there is, and this recipe is courtship. While many have dived into the idea that courtship and the mentality behind it results in perfection, this idea is surprisingly flawed. Meaning, the strict courtship mentality is an unhealthy mentality for Christians. So over the past 25 years, 2 main recipes have been on the rise for finding a spouse. There's the modern dating mentality and the courtship mentality. Modern dating has 3 main pillars. Anyone can be with whoever they want. There doesn't need to be a real purpose to the relationship, and love is based on pleasure and physicality. The pleasure-based mentality of modern dating began blossoming during the sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s. And as the sexual revolution took off, so did teen pregnancies and abortions. Now, because of this, parents to the next generation craved something to keep their children away from the mistakes that they had made or that they had seen. And out of this arose the courtship mentality. The specific strict courtship mentality that I will be speaking about today has 3 main pillars as well: physical purity, emotional purity, and parental control in relationship decisions. While physical purity has been a common form or a common practice throughout generations and is extremely important in the Christian walk, the idea of emotional purity is a new one that defines this more strict courtship mentality. Emotional purity, in reference to this type of courtship, is the idea that one should not give away any piece of his or her heart to someone to whom they are not married. This idea of emotional purity is most strongly established with the book I Kissed Dating Goodbye by Joshua Harris, which became the most popular foundation for the way in which Christians began finding potential spouses. And this book became so popular that he sold more than 1.2 million copies. 1.2 million copies that affected a lot of mindsets. Harris began his book by painting a picture of a man and woman on their wedding day. The couple was standing at the altar, excitedly waiting to be married, when suddenly multiple women came up and held the groom's hand. Now, Harris explains that not attaining emotional purity is like this picture. A man or woman will always have the extra baggage of past relationships and will never be completely whole on his or her wedding day if emotional purity is not attained. This new idea shook the nation. Parents, mentors, and church leaders leaped for joy as they finally had a book that could scare young adults into not only maintaining physical purity, but also emotional. Today, this strict type of courtship mentality continues to be a common form of prosperity gospel that states, if courtship and emotional purity are of God, inevitably, courting will be a foolproof way to avoid heartbreak and guarantee a perfect marriage. The marriage rate, even in the Christian community, however, has still continued to drop. So Christians are becoming more puzzled as to why this could be happening. The answer, however, is simple. While the recipe of Harris's courtship may have been based on good intentions, it gave the wrong solution to the problem. People are now realizing that the popular book that has been leading millions for years does not quite have the perfect idea after all. In fact, Harris has recently discontinued his book and has made a formal apology to the world for convincing it of a honey-dipped lie. Now, before I get into my points, I want to address a few things. First, by no means am I claiming that I'm a dating expert, master, or teacher. At 17, I can't really claim to be a master of anything. However, I am currently in the midst of experiencing how relationships work. I can look around right now and see how modern dating affects my peers and the way in which this courtship mentality affects them and myself. And I know this topic can be touchy and very tricky, so if you hold this mindset, I ask that you listen with open hearts as I am simply trying to get you all thinking. I also want to address a few refutations before I get into my points. Now, some will argue that this courtship mentality has worked out for some people, therefore it is a successful mindset. This idea, however, is flawed because a few examples of a success do not make the whole mentality a success. Good can sometimes come from a flawed idea, and sometimes a courtship mentality may work out, as it did with Harris. But to think of the courtship mentality as universally good and as the only way to go about finding a partner is fallacious. What is true to a part cannot be said of the whole. Now, if this courtship mentality is not the answer, though, should people run back to modern worldly dating? No, the pendulum should not be swung back to modern dating. The courtship mentality retains some good principles, such as respecting your parents and mentors and maintaining physical purity. These are very good ideas, standards that God places on us, his children, in love and protection. The way in which the strict courtship mentality goes about purity is not quite right, yet modern dating is even farther off from this. The Lord calls Christians to something much higher. For everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life comes not from the Father, but from the world. 1 John 2:16. Now on to my points. The courtship mentality, mainly seen in I Kiss Dating Goodbye, is an unhealthy mentality for Christians. It is unhealthy for 3 reasons. 1, it leads romantic relationships to crumble. 2, it leads to disunity. And 3, it leads to sin. A foundational idea in this courtship mentality is the idea that one must be in a relationship that is leading to a marriage. The idea of seeking a spouse for the purpose of marriage is not an evil idea by any means. In fact, it's good to continue a relationship in pursuit of marriage. But when for the purpose of marriage is broadcasted at the forefront of the relationship, as it is in this mentality, it implies that because the relationship is for the purpose of marriage, then God must allow the relationship to thrive. If a courtship is leading to marriage, if one can only give his heart to one person, and if God is for sure guiding the courtship, then ending the courtship turns into ending God's plan on one's life and losing emotional purity. This pedestal of either perfection ending in marriage or failure of God's plan ending in emotional impurity is a dichotomy that only leads to added pressure in romantic relationships. And a relationship built upon a foundation of pressure will crumble because pressure, in its definition, is meant to break things. This courtship mentality causes relationships to crumble because stringent purity rules are enforced. A common theme in this courtship mentality is the mandating of stringent purity rules in order to maintain purity. There's many purity rules that strict courtships offer. Some include striving to only court one person, marrying them, never experiencing heartbreak, having hardly any physical touch, having a chaperone at all times, and generally these courtship rules and emotional purity ideas are forced upon young adults without them having much of a say in the matter in this mentality. Purity rules and emotional standards like these, however, can cause couples and mentors to become naive. Most mentors see purity rules as something that they can rely upon to help their young adults remain accountable. Essentially, harsh lines are drawn so that young adults can get as far away from immorality as possible. The mentality of harsh rules proposes the idea that the stricter the rule will equal less temptation. Unfortunately, this is quite the opposite. In fact, the stricter the rule often leads to a greater desire to break the rule. Similar as if I told you not to look up at that spot right there. Your first reaction is to look at the spot. The common belief in strict courtships is that if every single rule is followed, then no danger can enter. But this naivety causes ignorance that can then breed mistakes. When less extreme and less mandated rules are put into place, the focus can then switch from the rules being a safeguard to a choice not made out of obligation, but out of a deep desire to be pure. This allows for less temptation and helps relationship standards to be realistic. Now, if these stringent rules cause harm in relationships, should all purity restrictions be removed? No, purity standards and boundaries are extremely beneficial and important in Christian relationships. However, guidelines should vary by the couple. While some couples may need and decide upon stringent rules for maintaining their purity, others may not need the line to be drawn so far. The mandatory enforcement of exact rules, however, causes unnecessary harm in the relationship. The courtship mentality also causes relationships to fail because of the way parents are taught to keep young adults from all relationships. See, in order to protect and keep loved ones from heartbreak, many strict courtship mentors are taught to rarely approve of partners and keep their young adults from relationships. Because relationships always mean a possibility of heartbreak. The disappointing fact, however, is that a good relationship may not be allowed to happen because no person can end up meeting every single perfect checkmark, physical standard, or emotional standard of a parent who is trying to keep their son or daughter from heartbreak at all costs. Keeping young adults from heartbreak is unrealistic and impossible because heartbreak is inevitable unless you marry the first person that you have feelings for. Heartbreak, while scary, is natural, and due to the fall, it is human, but it can lead to growth. Think of a mighty tree. It has a deep brown, strong trunk, branches which stretch high to the sky, and green leaves that seem to float in the air. Now you look at it and you can't seem to imagine that it was once as small as a tiny twig with roots that barely sunk past the grass. This tree, though, did not get to its majestic state without harsh rain, bitter winters, and dry seasons where its roots were almost sucked. See, these dry seasons, these painful seasons of heartache, they made the tree's roots dive a little deeper and allowed the tree to be where it is now. Life with pain and heartbreak can be extremely difficult, I know, but it is what shapes us in the end. And I'm certainly not arguing to go out and get your heart broken by 100 different people, but I'm saying that when heartbreak happens, because it will, even if one never courts or dates, it doesn't make us less pure or damaged goods as this mentality proposes. This strict courtship mentality causes romantic relationships to fail, but it also leads to disunity on a much larger scale. This courtship mentality leads to disunity within the family unit. This is because parents alone get to decide when a young person is ready to begin a relationship instead of the young person having a say in the matter. A common idea in the strict courtship mentality is that at age 16, 17, 18 years old, teenagers should be taught that they cannot know if God is leading them into a relationship because they are not spiritually or mentally mature enough for this. But this is a very confusing and damaging concept. Young adults do not understand why they can seemingly be saved by God, be youth leaders in the church, get jobs, obtain licenses for driving and voting, go to war, and yet cannot decide for themselves if God could possibly be leading them into a relationship. This concept teaches that only a mentor will know exactly when their young adult is perfectly ready to begin a relationship, but this breaks down. Think of yourself in a position where you have a crush on someone, because we've all had those. You're excited and open up to your parents about this because you trust them. Now, as you share your feelings, their response is a little bit shocking. Your mentor or parent says, no, this is all wrong. Your attractions are untimely and they're not God-given. Don't you think God would have told me if he was leading you into a relationship? Hearing this would be confusing and damaging, yet this is not an uncommon response for those who hold this mindset. Could this need for a perfect readiness or age be becoming an idol in our lives? But Angelia, aren't mentors always right? Maybe their son or daughter isn't ready for a relationship. And yes, advisors, mentors, and parents are so wise and beneficial. However, even if their son or daughter is not quite ready to be in a relationship, demanding a young adult to wait until the perfect time to begin seeking a spouse is like hindering a child from riding a bike because they have a potential of falling. There is a fear of falling and hurt, yet sometimes one must fall so that they can learn. And if heavy parental involvement in the courtship mentality causes disunity, should parents be completely uninvolved? Should young adults rebel against their mentors? No, of course not. Parents must be involved, and young adults must obey their fathers and mothers' wishes. However, mentors should also realize that their young adults must make decisions on their own at some point. They must coach them instead of dictating every single aspect of their lives. The courtship mentality also leads to disunity between the sexes. Before a courtship even begins, those who decide that their daughter or son will be in a future courtship stress the fact that their child must not have any emotional attachment or romantic relationship with the wrong person. Until a young adult is ready then, mentors keep boys and girls as far away from each other as possible to avoid temptation and to avoid emotional impurity. So, as soon as friendships seem to become something that could lead to a relationship in the future, contact must inevitably be lost between the boy and girl because their natural attractions are seen as shameful, untimely, and not God-given. See, young men, instead of being portrayed as honorable gentlemen, are portrayed as unable to control their desires in order to scare young women away from them as long as possible. And young women, instead of being portrayed as lovely, self-controlled ladies, are portrayed to young men as inappropriate and naive distractions. The Bible, however, never reduces God's children down to this. Relationships are cut off in order to save one from heartache, yet this causes heartache in of itself. This is the exact emotional battle that the courtship mentality promises to have taken away, yet it so easily can spur it on. But isn't it better to end friendships than to have young adults awaken love at the wrong time? While this comparison may put ending friendships in a good light, cutting off a relationship entirely is not the only option. And while steering young men and women away from each other may be a foolproof way of keeping them from having a relationship at the wrong time, it also leads to an inability to function properly in relation to the opposite sex. Stopping young adults from having innocent friendships is like placing them in a cave blocked off by barbed wire and locks. It may protect the young adult from some pain, but when it is time for them to enter the real world, how will they be able to adjust? At 17, young adults can seemingly not make decisions on their own, yet at 19 or any perfect number, they can suddenly court, fall in love, and be married in 3 months. How will a young man know how to treat a young woman as a gentleman if the only thing he is taught about women is to ignore them? And how will women know how to be pursued if they are always taught to run away from any man pursuing her? Furthermore, how will a young man or woman know how to handle rejecting a suitor when they are taught that heartbreak can only come from worldly dating? Finally, the courtship mentality is unhealthy for Christian relationships because it leads to sin. Having the courtship mentality leads to sin because it can easily add to God's word, which causes idolatry. The courtship mentality introduces ideas that are not found in the Bible and places them as biblical truths. Ideas such as emotional purity, strict physical boundaries, perfection, readiness, maturity, heartbreak, etc. are all stretched to extremes that are not in the Bible, yet they are professed in a way that states, if one does not follow these ideas, he is impure and tarnished. This puts perfection above truth. 1 Corinthians 10:14 says, therefore, my dear friends, flee from idolatry. God's word preaches this because anything, even rules meant for good, can easily be placed above God and his words and taken as gospel. And this idolatry further leads to sinful attitudes. As Kurt Allen, lead pastor of Solid Rock Church, says, whenever you take something and make it a biblical truth when it is not, you become Pharisees. This Pharisaical attitude leads to judgmental and prideful attitudes because suddenly those who are not following the courtship standards to the nth degree can be seen as less holy than those who are. Darcy, a woman who grew up in this mentality, explains that those who maintained perfect courtships thought of themselves usually as better than those around them. She says, quote, suddenly you are so much more spiritual than that poor girl over there who is crying because her boyfriend just broke up with her. You did it right, she did not. She is damaged goods, and you are the real prize. This is the prideful attitude that strict courtship mentalities can place upon people. God, instead of this judgment and pride, commands his believers to show love and grace. God is not a God of fear, shame, or pride. He is a healing God, a God of love. So, strict courtships tell young adults to flee from the opposite sex in fear, and modern dating tells young adults to run to the opposite sex in lust. Yet there must be a middle ground. There must be a perfect recipe that will lead to a perfect spouse, right? What is that recipe? Well, the answer to this question is that there is no perfect recipe. You see, recipes are confined to specific people, stories, and opinions, so formulas such as modern dating or strict courtships will never work out for every single person. Then how can we possibly go about finding a spouse in a healthy way? Well, there must first be a shift in mentality for mentors and for young adults. Mentors, parents, and churches must guide and teach young adults as they grow instead of dictating and mandating strict plans for their lives. They must teach living a life in devotion to God so that He will guide His children, instead of commanding opinions or following a recipe that may or may not work out for the individual. For true Christians, if one is striving to please the Lord and have a godly relationship, God will indeed guide them. And if one is living a life apart from God, they won't want to follow courtship rules anyway. Young adults should go about finding a partner by seeking advice from mentors and following basic principles found in Scripture. Some of these principles include knowing why they want to begin a relationship. Is it based out of lust or godly desires? Listening for God's will on his or her life. Guarding his or her own heart, meaning not placing the opposite sex as idols in their lives, and not seeking relationships based out of validation. Fleeing from sexual immorality and seeking a Christ-like love. If one is too young, let them grow and maintain an incredible friendship to see where it leads. Let the girl and boy get that cup of coffee. Let them speak in group settings and enjoy their time together while teaching them. Individuality is good, uniqueness is good, standards are good, but ignoring the reasons behind the rule will ignore the purpose of the rule to begin with. The courtship mentality is unhealthy for Christian relationships because it leads to failed relationships, disunity, and sin. In the end, one is not condemned to brokenness if they have had a broken heart. Yet because of this courtship mentality, many young adults find themselves damaged goods, unable to love and unable to heal. How many young adults who have had this mentality instilled into them crave friendships that they cannot have? How many end up losing their faith because of how they were treated based on this mentality? How many young ladies cry themselves to sleep at night, not because a boy who broke her heart, but because she was shamed and shunned for simply liking him? How many boys resent their families because they told him he was too young to be hearing God's voice? While parents, mentors, and young adults are striving to protect themselves and others, in reality, this protection can lead to greater pain. Heartache, while scary, cannot be avoided, and yet the risk of this is what makes our lives beautiful. As C.S. Lewis states, to love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything and your heart will certainly be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give your heart to no one. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness, but in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, and irredeemable.